dropping some knowledge and a little love. This is the Fire on Your Head podcast with your host, Steve Bremner. Steve Bremner, missionary to Peru and blogger at stevebremner.com. The podcast where we tackle gray areas your pastor doesn't talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bremner.
Greetings. You're listening to Fire on Your Head. And with me today, I've got Dan Dailey, who considers himself done with church. And if you're a reasonably long-time listener of the podcast, or you've been reading my blog for a while, you know that people confuse me with this, because there's this kind of false dichotomy people make. You either go to church or you don't. You attend meetings, and if you aren't, then you're either heathen or backslidden or whatever the case may be. And I'm all about organic. I'm all about if it's house churches or however it looks. And so to give a bit of a setup as to how this came about today, I don't remember how many months ago it was, but there was a blog somebody shared. I can't remember if it was Wayne Jacobson or someone. He shared a link to your blog on Facebook. I follow Wayne Jacobson. Actually, I've kind of patterned this podcast after the God Journey. And I noticed the same thing. You know, Dan was mentioning this kind of false dichotomy. You know, that people launch, and sometimes people on both sides don't hear the other out. And I always thought that this isn't like an argument or one side's right, the other side's wrong, but it's just kind of like different flavors of how people are doing the same thing. But when I wrote like a response or a follow-up or whatever you want to call it, where it's kind of like reflecting on Dan's blog post, and then that went like not viral, but it definitely got more traffic than I normally get. And I saw on a few places on Facebook where it was being shared all sorts of things like, well, Steve, I'm sorry to hear somebody hurt you. Well, like I'm not hurt. I'm a missionary, and we're making disciples. And it was like, I noticed, hey, we don't actually meet in a building. We do. A house is a building, you know?
Sure.
But,
sure.
But it's like, no, I'm not doing this out of some kind of principle or some kind of, frustration, or it's more like I'm seeing how this works and just don't care, you know, about, making sure to be doing it the way we've always done it, you know? And so I saw the same thing. I was seeing a bunch of different comments, different people, you know, say, well, the author of this blog post fails to see this, that, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I see that. I've written about that. You know, and so you can't really get down to these things in just like a single blog post, and not even necessarily a single podcast conversation. But, I've noticed every time I talk about or post something about, being done with church, organic or house church or missional or any of these different buzzwords that are, you know, loosely connected depending on the circles you're in. They get a lot of hits. You know, just yesterday I had somebody contact me about an article I've written 3 years ago about 5 things the house church movement is getting wrong. It's one of my biggest, you know, my top hits to my blog. And so I know people appreciate talking about this. They want to talk about, they want to throw stones or they want to listen, whatever the case is. And so Dan and I got in touch, and I listened to him on a podcast where I think there was 2 hosts, and one was kind of like suspicious of you and the other was open to you. And I wanted to invite Dan on and have a conversation where, well, there's no suspicion. You know, we're not going to have an argument, but I wanted to track, you know, your journey. So, welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks.
And I guess I want to start with, tell us a little bit about your background, and you know, take that however you want for how you got to leaving the institution, or however you want to phrase it. I mean, it's your journey, your story, you know?
Sure. Well, my background is, I say oftentimes I was practically born in a church pew. I've got, you know, a long line of pastors and ministers going down both my mom and dad's side of the family, you know, culminating to the point where As of about a year ago, I had been at my previous church for close to 20 years. But really I'm 35 now, but for the first 34 years of my life, I don't know that I ever missed 2 Sundays in a row. It may be a handful in any given year at best. And I've held most of the titles. I've done some preaching, and I was a worship leader and an elder, and taught different things and whatnot, and helped in all kinds of different areas. So I'm fairly well acquainted with, how that works. And if you had met me 2 or 3 years ago, if I had met me 2 or 3 years ago, I would probably, hit myself. We would have had some disagreements, for sure. And it's not that I don't understand. You talk about how people kind of just like, oh, you're just hurt, or you don't understand, or something like that. That's kind of a assumption that's made across the board. And I think it's an easy way to just defend, I suppose. In my case, Steve, there was a great deal of hurt that was involved, and that's not necessarily the case for everybody. Although, from the people I've met, I have seen that is more often the case than not. However, I don't think that it's the hurt. A lot of times, it seems to cause a questioning process, but it's not the hurt that, it's like a line in the sand being drawn bitterly, I'm never going back kind of thing. And that's what it was for me. I mean, there's still aspects of some of the changes that happened in the place that I was going to that I'm still working through in some ways, and I will be for a while probably. And that's just full disclosure. It's, there's a lot of stuff there. But more importantly, then what happened is what it caused me to start thinking. As an elder at that place, one of the earlier questions that I had to start grappling with is, as I was seeing some problems with what I saw going on, there was a change in leadership at the church that I was attending. We had a new executive pastor come on, and there was just a lot of things that were different that I couldn't get on board with. And I was struggling to figure out, I didn't want to just go off on my own opinions or anything like that. So I started seeking in the Word, what does the Bible have to say about the responsibilities, the duties of an elder? How am I supposed to go about all these deep concerns that I had, but do so the way that, the Bible would outline is the best way for me to do so? And as I started looking for answers to those questions, it started leading me to very different conclusions than I set out, is that there just really isn't that much there that says much of anything about ranks and hierarchies, at least not anywhere near the kind of way that we've built it up.
Right.
So that was one of the earlier things, but there was a whole slew of questions that started kind of just snowballing in after that too. Some of the touchier ones, like, tithing, for example, money. When you start touching people's money, it's amazing some of the reactions you'll start getting.
Right. I saw a picture on Facebook, I don't know, a month ago or something, and it was of like a cartoon of a pastor baptizing someone, but they were holding like their wallet above the water. So. Yeah. Well, and that was another thing is, as I started looking at that, it was just another thing where, well, for one, it got me into some trouble. It very quickly put me on the outside of certain circles. But for me personally, aside from the hurt that caused, what I'm saying is it's not the hurt so much that drove me to the conclusions, but looking at these questions and seeing the kinds of responses. I was surrounded by people, friends that I'd had for a long, long time, and even family that, I just, here I am. I was actually preparing to preach about tithing. And as I'm getting ready that week, studying, to amass my army of scripture,
that, as I'm digging, I'm finding the opposite of what I expected to find. And I had to bow out. I said, I can't do this. I can't preach this week. But as I started digging into that, and then I just wanted to have those conversations with people because my head's spinning. I mean, here I am. This is something that I've believed hardcore, and I'm seeing something else. I just want to start having some open dialogue with people about difficult questions, but not just things I'm making up, things I'm reading. I'm wanting to say, here, look, turn the page. Let's look at this because this seems to say something different. And the kind of responses that I was getting, across the board, from leaders. And I guess that was the interesting thing, is that it's not that there was a shortage of people willing to take a look and discuss, but they weren't leaders. And if I was going to talk to anybody that wasn't a leader, now I'm being divisive and subversive and trying to pull people away or something like that. It's like, I'm just trying to have a conversation here. So those kinds of things, I guess, just led me when it finally, there was a series of events and I stuck it out there once things started changing for about 8 months, 7-8 months. And it finally just got to the point where it was pretty obvious that this was not going to work. I was not going to be able to stay. But in that, then you have to ask the question of, well, where are you going to go? Right. And which forced me to start looking at this whole, swirling cloud of questions and everything that had started coming up and all of this, and coming to the conclusions personally that these are things that are endemic to an institution, period. This is not localized to where I was at. These kinds of problems, I came to see them as the inevitable conclusion of really any institution. That I guess one of the core things I started to see is that for any institution at all, whether religious or otherwise, in order for an institution to exist, period, its members have to at least agree on one core thing, and that is that the institution must exist. You can't have people inside the institution questioning whether or not the institution should exist at all. And for me, that was an inherent problem because if, let's just come back to church here. If you've got somebody there that is openly asking questions whether or not a church institution is a good idea, and everyone can come to different conclusions. It's not even that you have to be asking these questions forcefully or trying to beat people over the head. But if the institution is going to naturally, just by its very existence, become an obstacle to that kind of questioning, that kind of raises the hairs on my neck a little bit. Because there should be nothing about us getting together that stifles us being able to ask any kinds of questions. Right. So it was like, I began to see it as almost unavoidable. If you're going to be at a place and start asking questions about, well, why aren't pastors in the Bible? I mean, why is Ephesians 4:11 the only time that pastors are actually mentioned? And even at that, it's only dependent upon which translation you're using. And it mentions nothing about a job description, what they do. Right.
And then even the typical or modern way of that job description, like the pastor or the lead elder or whatever, depending on what denomination you're in, you can't even find that in the Bible as much as, as some people would tell you. We just don't question it. We go with it. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
No, it's fine. The whole idea of singular leadership, period. I mean, even the letters, and I think my understanding of elders would probably even be different from a lot of people's. But even if you're going to go with that, any time you see in the epistles where they're being written to the elders, plural, at this place or that place, it's not the guy in charge, the spiritual covering, if you will. I mean, this kind of idea that a person is your covering before God sets him up as a mediator, and I think is in stark contrast to Matthew 23, where we're told not to call anybody father or rabbi or this idea of titles that we look up to them and we sit underneath them. That is in no way supported by Ephesians 4:11, which simply mentions the word pastor, arguably,
Right.
And says nothing of what it is. It's just a shepherd. It's just a person that cares. In fact, the word is used like 18 times in the New Testament, and it's always translated as shepherd, except for this one time.
And usually it's about Jesus, not a person.
Right. Right.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah. So anyways, but coming back to the ability to ask openly those kinds of questions, that is when your entire job and salary is riding on the idea that pastors exist and they are workmen worthy of their hire and so on. Asking those kinds of questions in a public forum begins to cause concern for people who are dependent on these ideas being true.
Right. And that's, let's jump on that.
Yeah.
Because as you were talking earlier and you were mentioning how, you basically were correct me if I'm wrong. So you were basically like a type of pastor or some kind of paid position, or did I get that wrong?
I was a worship leader and I was an elder and I occasionally preached. I was never titled as a pastor.
Gotcha. And because I wrote this little note down and I was going to ask you about it or whatever, but I think now is a good time to, it's easy for the spectator type of Christian, like there inevitably is that clergy laity divide in an institutional type of thing. Even when pastors, and I know some awesome godly guys who are like supporters of ours, who are like this, and they don't feel like I'm attacking them. They love the discussion, and they want their whole congregation to be participants. They want that everyone to be making disciples. They want everyone to be doing the stuff of the kingdom. They don't want to be like this individual at the top of the pyramid. They want to be like just one extra person in the flock, but it just inevitably falls that way, where most people will attend their churches as like an attendee. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like inevitable in a lot of the way we do church that only kind of like you maybe have heard the 20% of a congregation will do like 80% of the work and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so it's inevitable we have a passivity that happens, and as such, it's very easy for someone who's not in that, if you want to call it clergy. It's much easier for like an attendee, someone attending these events, or I'm nicknaming them events for our conversation. It's much easier for one of those people to pack up and leave and go, yeah, whatever. I don't need to attend church to be connected to God. But it's kind of more interesting when it is someone who's really in that system, such as a pastor or some kind of professional clergy, because, I'm reading statistics all the time about different people who stay stuck in that because they don't have other job skills. They don't have other ways of, so, I don't know how to say the quote, but it goes along the lines of, you can't convince, a man to change his mind if his job depends on it not being changed. You know what I mean? Like, and so I don't know. I'd love to explore more of how that might have been for you, coming to the conclusion to kind of extract yourself, because I don't think I've really sat down and chatted with someone who, that's the way they went, so I just would love to hear like your angle on things. 'Cause I think there is a sense of, security, you know what I mean? In this system, I know people who, won't take, preaching invitations unless there's like minimum offerings, or they have like the next 6 months of meetings lined up, and just stuff like that I'm not saying is wrong or I'm criticizing, but like as a missionary living on support, having to freelance, having had to explore these kinds of things where it can be a conflict of interest. Yeah. I'm definitely curious when I hear other people who pastor or are elders, and they decide like, you know what, I'm done with this, or I for whatever principle have to get out of this. Anyway, I threw a lot at the wall, but what out of that is sticking, you know?
Yeah, well, I think the quote you were talking about is by Upton Sinclair. I've got it here on one of my blog posts. It says, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
That's the quote.
And it's so true. But I think that there are definitely – I've read a lot about people who are in those positions, like you were saying, that really probably would step away. It's not that they don't understand even, but they're caught in a place of fear and dependence. And so that's a sad thing as well. It's funny. A lot of the people I've connected with in Facebook in the last year since I've left, a lot of them actually are ex-pastors, ex-title holders, money makers on the gospel. So it's not that there aren't those that have left either. Actually, there's
that's not what I'm saying. But,
I know,
but you get where I come from.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult. I was never in any way financially dependent. I did get a little bit of a stipend as the worship leader. Mm-hmm. I kind of slowly started backpedaling away from some of the things I was seeing. I stepped down from the elder position quietly without telling anybody. And then, a couple months after that, and it wasn't planned as a slow exit. It was just like I couldn't hardly stay where I was at. And I wasn't looking to make a stink about it either. I wasn't, with trumpet sound, here I am, all of this is just baloney. But then after a couple of months, I had to step away from the worship leading thing, but I kept playing on the platform a couple times a month. And then I stepped away from that too. I couldn't even do that anymore. But as far as, one of the things that you mentioned is that there's like a passivity that kind of comes up in that sort of institution, and this gap between the clergy and laity. I think that having any kind of an institution where there is this the head is clearly seen in any institution, whether it's religious or otherwise. There is a difference. Just by the very fact that the institution exists, there has to be a difference. There are those who are in charge. There are those that manage the resources. There are those that make all the decisions. They are up here and you are down here. And I think one of the damaging things about that is that in issues of faith and our relationship with God, it starts to become seen as, if I really want to devote myself to God, then I'm going to be more like this guy. I'm going to become a pastor, a missionary, whatever, a person of title and, full-time ministry, which I think stems personally from a misunderstanding even of what ministry is.
Right.
Because what was it so clearly modeled by Jesus more than anything else was just to love people. The commandments were to love the Father and to love our neighbors in the way that he did. We can find a few cases where, Jesus had a crowd following him around and he delivered a message to a group of people. But we far more often see the case of, Zacchaeus and the woman at the well and the woman caught in adultery and, the Samaritan woman that, begged for scraps like a dog would, beg from off the table of the master. And,
right.
It's all these one person, one-on-one, interactions where it's this moment where he just speaks life into them in a way that is so much more impactful. Sometimes it's a word, sometimes it's a healing, sometimes it's a meeting of a need of some sort, whatever. That's ministry. What Jesus said was, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. That's what he called us to do. It's just to love people and to see where they're at and not turn them away and say, oh, be blessed and well fed.
Right. And I was thinking of something else, and I have no idea what your reaction to it will be, with regard to these kind of one-on-one or smaller things, just to kind of pivot a little bit in a different direction. But, a month ago or whatever it was at the time of recording this, So that's a month ago is relative to whenever this is online. The Supreme Court, the United States legalized gay marriage.
Right.
And I'm watching kind of like on the outside looking in, but at the same time, like watching animals inside of a cage, just with wonder at the type of stuff flooding my Facebook. Because in Canada we had that happen like 10 years ago and the sky didn't fall and all these kind of things. But one thing, and there's still so few people that are really making us think about it. But anyway, our cultures are different in that regard. I saw over and over again people talking about how, okay, it's the beginning of the end of our rights as churches. They're going to basically push to have our tax exempt status removed. Mm-hmm. And I immediately had this thought go through my mind, like, well, it doesn't affect me. Not because I'm Canadian, not because I'm organic, but more like if you don't have a tax exempt status, it doesn't matter if that's removed. And that's like a positive or a, if someone's going to pause the recording, or this chat right now and not hear what I'm about to say, that'll be bad for you. But if you're already not institutional and not all these other things where you are hooked up to the system and need that tax exempt status and all that kind of stuff, then that doesn't affect you. You know what I mean? It's like,
right.
Like if you stab a dead body, it's nothing else happens. It's dead, And so I had that reaction when I started seeing people fear for, and that ties in a bit, like I said earlier, about that sense of security with the way this is all set up. In China, they seem to be doing just fine, not being sanctioned by the government. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Being under strong persecution. In North America, we don't have that type of persecution. Being told you have to bake a cake is not like, like having your head chopped off for being a Christian, but
if you had the choice between the two, I think the choice would be pretty clear.
Oh, I'll make that. I'll make the cake.
I'll make 10 of them.
Yeah. And that would never have been like an issue for me if I were in that position. But anyway, I don't want anyone listening to this to feel like my saying that is criticizing if they wouldn't. But, so I say all of that to say, it's interesting to me to look at, every time something like this happens in culture, there's that fear or that outcry, like, we're going to lose our privilege of this or our right of that. But like, who says any of that is what will help us be church or not be church?
Nope.
Anyway, any thoughts or reaction or,
So many, more than we'd have time for. A lot of my thinking about institutions has extended way beyond church. The more I've thought on stuff, institutions in general are the way that human beings like to do everything. If that can extend to governments. It's healthcare, it's school systems, it's workplace, it's military, it's always systems. Jesus was somebody who stood there toe to toe with Pilate, who's asking him, "Don't you know who I am?" And Jesus is like, you are nobody but what the Father has made you. Jesus looks right through all of the trappings as though they're not there, all the trappings of this institutional hierarchy stuff. And he sees a man. He's God himself, and he could walk away at any point. But see, what Jesus didn't do is seek to tear it down either. He told people, "Hey, pay your taxes, submit to your governing authorities." And Pilate's there, and Jesus is under threat of dying, and so Jesus says, "Okay, I'll die." He didn't have to. We get very caught up in civil liberties and rights, but I think one of the cues that I take not only from Jesus but from the disciples when we read, in Acts and other places in the New Testament, one of my favorite stories is Paul and Silas sitting there in jail, and they're praising God, singing, and suddenly an earthquake comes, and the chains fall off their hands and feet, and the jail doors to the cells swing open, And, the modern day evangelical would be, yes, God has freed us. And, here we go. God has restored our civil liberties. But, Paul's response was, clearly God is doing something here. I want to find out what it is. There was no regard for him and his rights or what was going to happen to him. It was for the Lord first and foremost, and secondly to the jailer.
Right.
And because of this, the jailer was saved. His entire family was saved, and Paul remained in captivity. The last 8 chapters in Acts record, Paul in captivity, and he went to it knowingly that this is what was going to happen. It could very well be the end of him. And he was even told a couple times along the way, once by a prophet, prophesying, hey, this is going to happen. Don't go. And he goes. So
that doesn't sound like your best life now. What are you doing, Paul?
No, it doesn't. So I guess one of the analogies that I make a lot of times is, if I were a special ops, special forces sort of guy dropped in the jungles of Korea, and I'm told that I'm going to be there for an indefinite amount of time. I have a mission, and I'm going to be there till Lord knows when. So I'm hanging out in the jungle for a while, and eventually I start, cautiously making my way out, and maybe start getting some under the table employment, work my way towards getting an ID, getting a more permanent place to live, and over the course of time integrate myself into the culture, maybe even get married. I have no idea how long I'm going to be there. But so long as I still have in mind that I'm on a mission, what business is it of mine if that country begins to pass healthcare laws about marriage, laws about anything? Unless they in some way impact the mission that I'm on, what do I care? That's not my land. That's not my country. Right. I'm not a citizen there. I'm not all caught up in my civil rights as a soldier there. I'm on a mission.
Right.
And I think we forget our mission. This is not where we live. I joke sometimes, what happens if, say, China comes over and takes over America? I'm Chinese. That's what happens. And that's to oversimplify it a little bit. Yes, there's terrible things that could happen, but since when is that new? Historically, I think America has enjoyed this nice little bubble for the last couple hundred years of amazing freedoms, and that's great on the one hand, but I think that it also can foster a lot of laziness, and I think you could make the case that, like China or like the first century church, perhaps the church is at its best actually when it's void of all those things.
Right. And I can't say those things without being told, yeah, well, you don't understand, you're Canadian, or you're not American, or you're talking as an outsider. And so many people listening to this are Americans anyway. And so, I'll touch it this way. I think sometimes when you look at the background of both Canada and the United States, when you look at how these two countries were founded and formed on so much the principle of like religious liberties and freedoms and stuff, I think that's been a double-edged sword in terms of the church, of the body of Christ, of the kingdom of God in the last couple centuries. Because now, when I look at these different things, more so in the United States than Canada, not because, one's better than the other, but for just the different ways those two cultures have kind of developed. In the United States, like I tell Peruvians all the time, stuff with gay marriage or stuff with rights, and I like to use the word privilege rather than right. Mm-hmm. When there's something more ingrained in the American mentality that no one's going to tell me I can't do something, whether that's a Christian, a church, or the church saying nobody's going to tell me I can't practice my religion or do, and then you have other groups like gays and lesbians and so on saying, well, no one's going to tell me I can't pursue my life the way I want either. And so I think that it's inevitable. There's a clash. There's an explosion when these different conflicting things, finally come to the type of boiling point they've come to in the last few decades and generations or whatever. And so I think it's been, for that reason, unhealthy or not necessarily good that it's not bad that there's freedom and there's these kind of things, but what has been bad about that is it's caused people to confuse like their constitutional rights, with
right.
Their understanding of scriptures and stuff. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, well, and I think that they're in contrast, really, when you're looking at Jesus saying they're going to hate you as they hated me and pick up your cross. And,
yeah.
I mean, and here we are in God's name demanding freedoms and rights that are God-given. I'm not saying that God doesn't have that for people. I mean, if you have it, then he has it for you.
Right.
And certainly there's a case to be made that there are people recorded in the Bible, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and you look at King David and Solomon, and I mean, they were well off.
Right.
In many cases, I would say in most cases, almost all of them, these people also had a season prior to that time of what we would call blessing that was very difficult. Right. It wasn't all daisies and roses for them all the time.
Let me rephrase what I was saying. An unintended consequence. Like, I'm not saying having freedom and stuff like that is bad, but an unintended consequence I see is how so many more people are preoccupied with just keeping it, just civil liberties, but not necessarily going and trying to bring that to other nations, other kingdoms of this world who don't have it. It's more about holding the fort down. Nobody's going to take any of my rights and freedoms away from me. Okay, right. But then what? Like it's kind of a cultural thing more than a kingdom thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And so I worry that has affected the church so much that we make it about. Anyway, I invited you on to talk about house church, and this is great. We're going in this direction, but like I think that has seeped into kind of the institutional church too. This kind of spiritual feudalism, where it is a type of. Anyway, we've been using the word institution a lot in this conversation. That's where I'm coming from. I'll phrase it: unintended consequence.
It absolutely it's made its way there too, because it's in us as human beings. So it makes its way into anything that we as human beings set up. I think one of the things is that we've got these core natures, these sinful natures in us, and when we build an institution, no matter how benevolent, our idea of what that's going to be, our nature gets set into the very foundation of that institution. Mm-hmm. And church is not an exemption. And as it grows, those seeds germinate and take root and begin to grow right alongside with the institution. And eventually, there is no institution that either doesn't die out or lives long enough to become corrupt and then dies out. None. There is no government. There is no church. There is no anything that doesn't ultimately end that way. And the kingdom of God, if it's going to last forever, if it's going to be such that the gates of hell do not prevail against it, cannot be made of the same stuff. Mm. There's just no way. I wrote a post recently talking about this affluence and hanging on to our stuff. I wrote a post on my blog recently that was trying to draw some details out about assets under the control of the church worldwide. And it's potentially in the trillions of dollars.
Right.
It's insane. But on average, and this is across the board, whether you're a small church or big church, on average, 5% of the money that comes into a religious institution actually makes its way into something that Jesus would call ministry, helping people. 60% right off the top is going to paid salaries. Another 20% on average is going to expenses, building expenses, office expenses, utilities, this kind of thing. So right off the bat, you've got 80% that's just going to those kinds of institutional operation kind of things. And so I guess one of my questions is if Jesus were to come and, be the new senior pastor at XYZ church, is that what he would do? I mean, would he be like, I'm going to take hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of dollars every year that comes in, and I'm going to make sure that, everyone's paid, and then we got this nice building taken care of with the sound system and, everything, the decor and signage and marketing. We got to make sure everyone knows about what's going on here. I mean, is that really what he would do? I mean, does the kind of ministry that Jesus himself modeled look anything like the sort of programs and systems that we're doing?
Right.
But when you start doing that mentality that you're talking about, where we try to protect our assets, protect our rights, protect our liberties, all the things that we have amassed to ourselves, kicks in, even in church.
Right.
Absolutely in church. Well, in no way different.
Well, what I'm thinking of is when in Matthew, is it 21 or so, when he and Mark 11 is that account where he goes to the temple, and in Mark's account he looks around, and the next day comes back, makes a whip, and does some table flipping,
right.
And one of the things that every time I teach that to my students here, we make this joke about how Jesus had a temper, and it's like no. If you come and you look around and come back the next day, that's not impulsive behavior. That's deliberate response.
Sure.
But not only that, in Matthew's account, it says after he did that, it says the blind and the crippled came in, and he healed them, and that's no small side note. If you go back and you look at the law of Moses, there was all these different prohibitions. If someone had their this was wrong with them, they couldn't come in for 7 days and blah blah blah. There's all these rules where basically that system, if you want to call it that, institution, was hindering instead of helping. And Jesus came along and basically set it right. My house shall be called a house of prayer, but somehow you guys got off track. And here we are doing it this way, and I think not so much that he would not to comb through each point you said about the sound system and all these salaries. I don't know particularly, when we get down to details, what he would do about all those different things. But I think there would be that general, at least that general response of okay, let's get back on track to what my father had intended this to be. Does that make sense? And the blind, the sick, the outcast, the people who couldn't really participate in that before, I would imagine would feel like they could after he came. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think potentially with the caveat that I don't think personally that he was trying to clean up the temple and reinstitute a temple as being what the temple was supposed to be. But the entire faith system of the people had definitely gone awry.
Right.
And so from that point forward, whether we're doing that inside of temples or whether we're just doing that as relations and, kind of coming back full circle to the house church, organic church, simple church, whatever you want to call it. Those are all labels I don't like.
No problem.
Yeah. I mean,
because I don't even know what to call it. So I just use those.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the question is whether or not it is an it at all. I mean, the church is a they. The church is a people. And I don't personally, I guess what I've begun to believe is that we get together with saved people and unsaved people alike. I mean, we live our lives. We are who we are. We represent God everywhere we go. And certainly we're going to be drawn to and have relationships with other people who are people of faith and other believers. And we're going to talk about the things that God is doing in our lives. We have a bunch of friends that we've started getting together with every Sunday in the evenings over at our place. And even that, saying that much sometimes gives me a little bit of the EBG because I don't like that it's a set date and time. But it's convenient to be able to have a time where a house is open and anyone can come over. But aside from the fact that it's in my house, if you were to walk in and didn't know whose house it was, you wouldn't know that there's somebody who's in charge, because there's nobody in charge. We're just hanging out and we're talking about life, and that's not always the Bible. It's just whatever, and the conversation is very fluid. It moves back and forth between work and kids, and talking about the Bible and discussing spiritual topics and ideas and praying for each other, sometimes singing. But there is literally no plan except that people are going to come over and we bring food, we hang out and we eat, and that's it. And
that sounds great, because one of these questions I wrote down for you as we're talking was if you would describe, like, what's your fellowship with other believers like now? So I'll rephrase the question, because you're already answering it. When you have people tell you, well, Dan, Hebrews says to not forsake the fellowshipping together. So, and they somehow conclude that means you're supposed to attend something every Sunday morning. So I was going to ask you, so like, what do you say you're doing when asked about that?
I feel like, you want a fellowship? Come over, let's barbecue. What does it say beyond that, really? There's so much you can read into it from assumptions that we're already making because of what we do and what we want to continue doing. But I don't see any of that there. Like I said, when we're getting together, there's nobody in charge. There's no plan. And I have actually, and my wife has helped me in this, in moments where maybe I have gotten a little anxious, nervous, and maybe faltered on this point. She kicks in and reminds me, but my wife and I have proactively just at anything that even begins to look like, hey, let's structure this, hey, let's structure that, we proactively push against it. I'm not doing that. I'm not, you guys come, don't come. You want to go through a book of the Bible, do it. I'm not doing that.
Right.
So there's none of that going on. But personally, I'd like to see that even be, different than what we have. And we have what God's given us right now. But I'm always, trying to be like, well, God, what are we still just, even though we're not even doing anything when we get together, sometimes I just think, man, I want to be with just, my neighbors. I don't know my neighbors' names. I'm not a very outgoing person.
Right.
And that's kind of, and I guess in some ways that's almost an American thing. Really, a lot of people don't know their neighbors.
Right.
But just relationship. Why does it have to be a thing? Why does it have to be a gathering? It's just love the people around you, wherever you happen to be. I think it's really nothing more than that. It's so simple that I think it grates on people. Like, it can't be that. There's got to be more to that, and we've got to structure this. We've got to
make it more complicated.
We have to form a system and write a book and have a package that we can deliver to other people that want to do the same thing, so they can follow our system. And dude, no, it's not like that.
Right. If you don't mind, I want to spend some more time on that verse in Hebrews.
Sure.
Not because I'm not satisfied with your response, but because that's like the key verse.
It is the Billy Club.
Yeah, that's the Billy Club people beat you with. And if you're not attending something, they cite that verse and say not to forsake the fellowshipping together. Do you have some context, some knowledge for the listener about who people think it was Paul who wrote Hebrews, who Paul was like, what Paul was dealing with when he wrote those guys and was telling them, to not. Do you have any?
Well, one of the things that I've heard, and I think makes sense, is that the context would be you've got people that are under persecution, being hunted down potentially, even as Paul himself was going not church to church, but house to house, seeking, to kill people. And, one of the things I've heard is that this is a response to those who would be afraid to continue to get together with other believers because of that persecution. I don't think anybody needs a command to get together with other people that share things in common with them, least of all their faith. If it's central to who they are, you don't have to tell somebody who loves the Lord. You don't have to order them, hey, get together with other people who share this in common with you. Seriously, when I come across people who have quote, left the church, which, I think if you have an understanding of what the church is, you can't leave it. But people who have left the institutional system, the first response is always, oh, what am I going to do about fellowship? No one needs to tell them. They want to get together with people. Actually, in a way, I've heard that so many times from people where they almost feel like they're sinning because they're not in some kind of group thing, with other people. I wrote a blog post that really kind of, centers around Hebrews 24 and 25 for those people, because it broke my heart. It's like, man, you're not sinning. Let's come back and have a better understanding of this and what it is to actually get together with each other. One of the things, and this is kind of one of the things I touched on in that post too, but when we were looking at leaving the church that I had been at for the past 20 years, one of our, or really church period, it wasn't even just that place, we were looking at coming away from all of it, permanently. The question, in my mind is, for my family's behalf, oh man, are we going to fall away from God? Are we going to, because that's the scripting. That's what is almost beaten into you. Like, if you don't do this, if you don't go to church and all that, you're going to fall away, become a sinner, heathen. And, man, is that going to happen to me?
Did you ever see the movie, The Village?
Yes.
Yeah. And they were living in that village and they would scare everybody. But then when the daughter got out, they, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the ending for the listener. Oh no, it's this little isolated village that they had, been living in without technology and stuff because they were avoiding disappointment. They were avoiding fear. Everyone in that village had lost a loved one in some way to drunk driving or whatever the case may be. And I think of that sometimes. There's like this electric fence we build around fellowship and say, don't wander past that barrier, because if you do, you're going to fall off a cliff and die. So you better just stay here and do what your pastor tells you, or whatever.
And the fear is real. It is. The fear is real, man. And I had a line of people coming up to me, concerned for my soul. Don't do this. Don't leave, because these bad things are going to happen. The monsters are going to eat you. And honestly, I was one of the people in line saying that to myself. I was scared. But then all of a sudden it occurred to me, and I make this analogy in the post that I wrote about this, but I make this analogy of imagine there is a club for married men. And the men in this club, their marriages are the stuff of dreams. Stepfordy kind of, just like fantasy, amazing marriages, right? And it's all attributed to this club. And they warn everybody that, this is all good and great, but to tell you, whenever people leave this club, they go and they cheat on their wives, they beat their wives, they do all these bad things, and their marriages fall apart. I would conclude that these guys are liars. They don't love their wives. They have this thing that every single week reminds them, beats them over the head, love your wives, love your wives, love your wives. And if it takes that for them to love their wives, they're faking it. They don't love their wives. And in the context of church, look, you're either his or you're not. You either love him or you don't. And if you are someone who doesn't, and you need something beating you over the head every single week to remind you to keep up the facade, you would be far better off to let that drop away and see your relationship with God for what it really is and deal with it in truth, than to keep up pretenses with a God who can see right through it anyways. You're not fooling anybody but yourself. And when I began to see it that way, it's like, well, I guess I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out. Do I love him or not? Because when I read, the Bible, and I look in Acts, I look at the first century church, man, these were people who were hunted like dogs. They were beat down, scattered, chased, persecuted in every way, imprisoned and killed. And they sought the Lord. But so much of the brand of Christianity that I see around me seems like, well, if we change the speaker, if we change the style of music, I can't go here anymore. I got to go find somewhere else.
Right.
Sunday
school program.
Yeah.
They've got a good Sunday school program.
I've got kids now. I can't keep going to this place because they don't have a good kids program. So I'm going to have to go somewhere that does. I mean, if all the people sitting in that building, if somehow you were to magically lift the building right up off of their heads and they're sitting out there in the open, would they continue to get together every week? And if not, what were they doing? I mean, what was it about, really? It's like another analogy I use a lot of times, but if I had a passion to pick up trash around town here where I live, I'd go out and pick up trash. While doing that, I might meet other people that pick up trash.
Wow, I don't have that gift.
I don't either. This is a hypothetical, Steve. But if I meet other people along the way doing this, we might start getting together and, doing it together. And as more people, this is ridiculous because people aren't just driven by a passion to pick up trash, but let's say we keep running into more and more people. So we start getting together and we start getting together every week. And we start, talking about, how to better pick up trash. And we start having studies about picking up trash. And we start writing songs about picking up trash and appointing people to give talks about picking up trash. And we're not out there picking up trash anymore. I mean, in fact, we've got elaborate buildings and systems and everything to really glorify how wonderful it is to pick up trash. But we aren't doing it anymore. Right. Picking up trash requires none of those things.
Right. Well, you know what I thought you were going to say, where I thought you were going with that you had your eyes open, that it's not a matter of picking up trash, but about cleaning up your neighborhood or your city and discovering there's lots of other ways besides just picking up trash that you can do that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
there's an overlap there because it is serving the people around you. And which I think is part of why why I like that analogy, because it is something that benefits the community but I think we make it about something so complicated and we completely lose the focus. We completely lose who we are, our identities in Christ, and we make it about all these trappings that Jesus didn't have. And I can't imagine for the life of me, if I gave Jesus $100,000 budget or $1 million budget every year, that he'd be, making buildings and paying salaries. And I mean, would he even take the money in the first place? I'm not even sure.
I can't pretend that I do know, but I just saw this on my tablet, this quote in Facebook, and you can't figure out what people mean by just bite-sized tweets all the time. But because we're talking about this, let me throw it at you. This is exactly what it says. If there are no elders keeping watch over your soul, you are engaged in a kind of church/ministry that is beneath the intention of God. And I thought, what a coincidence. We're talking about this. Do you have a thought about what that could be saying?
How in the world can you have that view and not hold this elder to be above everybody else in some different? It's like we have a caste system that exists within Christianity. Who is over the elder and who is over that guy? And why is it that they are somehow closer to God? They have a better what? If it's not about an intellectual pursuit, like the more I know about God, the closer to him I am. What does your relationship with your wife look like? I mean, the more you know about her life, the more you it's just about being with her and knowing what she wants and doing that and serving her. It's relationship. And any one of us, no matter our pedigree or training, can have that. I don't think the first century church was a bunch of people sitting around reading their Bibles because they didn't have Bibles and a lot of them couldn't read.
Right.
They loved one another. I mean, these are people, fishermen that knew Jesus and had their lives changed. He modeled for them a kind of love that is uncommon to humanity. And they went and they did that. And some of them went out as apostles. Some of them went out, evangelizing. But honestly, many of them didn't. I mean, when we see in Acts 15, all the apostles and leaders, if you want to call them whatever, they're getting together to discuss things. Most of them were already there in Jerusalem. They weren't assembling. They were already there because they hadn't gone anywhere. They never left. It's not like every single person who, came to a knowledge of Jesus went out and dropped and did everything. I mean, even those like Paul who are going along were helped along the way by people who were established in a building, their home, not a church building, but they weren't evangelists like Paul. Anyways, but coming back to what you were saying, there's this built-in idea that this guy, this elder, is closer to God. And though nobody would say it out loud, isn't that the implication? Isn't that the inference? That they are a covering over you, and you are going to fall away because you are different from him.
Right.
He has a special anointing, a special call. That's just ridiculous.
Right.
It's totally ridiculous and counter-biblical. I don't think that.
I wanted to see what your reaction was going to be to it, because I have no idea what to make of it, because the brother who posted this, I know is very big into organic, and for a number of years had a meeting in his own home every Sunday. And I'd be curious to ask him what he means by it. But the phraseology about having elders keeping watch over you, I thought, what a coincidence. I just happened to come across that while I'm talking to you. And
I think when you're talking about a home church, an organic church, one of the things I've found is that is such a fuzzy, everyone's got a different idea, a different take. One time I went to a place here just around the corner from where I live, and a group of people had been meeting in this home for close to 15 years, I think. And but it was a church service. There was one guy who talked the entire time, and they were loving people. They were good people, but literally for 90 minutes to 2 hours, there was only one guy that spoke. Sitting in the living room, and it was not what you would expect, from a loving kind of everyone sitting together and hanging out in a smaller atmosphere. It was everything about the institution just miniaturized.
Right.
And that is some people's concept of what a home church is, and that's not what I would be into at all.
Instead of having pews, you have folding chairs and couches and whatever, but everything is just basically transplanted into a smaller setting or whatever the case may be. I hear you, and I know some guys who, like 4 or 5 years ago, they kind of up and left and were doing house church. But then this one brother told me, I'm sick of house church too, because all this particular group of believers I'm getting together with, all that they do is they just basically talk about how come house church is what you're supposed to do. So it's like, instead of actually growing, we basically spend our meetings talking about how we're not institutional and bash institutional. And I'm sick of that. I want to grow. And so he said, I went back to, instead of the church he left, he went to like another, I don't know, like a Lutheran service or something. And he likes that much better. And he was saying, it's about growth. It's not about like are you growing? Are you building the kingdom of God? Are you making disciples? Are people getting saved? Do your neighbors know who you are? That kind of stuff is more important to me than the package you do it in. So that's why I'm careful to not say like I'm against institution. Sure. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying that's where I am. And but for all intents and purposes, when I look at the New Testament, I see that the likelihood of them being in homes and stuff like that is how they did it. And so it probably wasn't our idea, like you're saying, of house church meetings. So some house church, organic, whatever label, can be just as hardline religious as an institutional church.
Or more.
Yeah, or more.
Actually, this group that I visited, I would say in their case was more.
Right.
I didn't go back, and again, they're wonderful people. One of them is a friend of mine, actually, the guy who leads it, which is how I came across it. But I was just like, if we're going to do this, I'd rather just go back to where I was at. It's not any different. But I think also. One of the questions it comes to goals and objectives, measuring our efficacy, how efficient are we? How effective are we? How many people have we baptized and this kind of thing? And I don't have everything worked out completely, and I never will. I've got questions on this, but my leaning at the moment is that, we're supposed to love people and leave their own journey, their own walk. I mean, we encourage, we point, we share the truth that God has given to us, but it is not ours to say, look, I have built the church. Look, I have grown in number. Fling seed everywhere you go. Absolutely. Speak truth, speak life, love people, meet their needs. Don't look at them and the things that they need and say, oh, I could meet that, but I'm busy. Love people, but I don't think it's about then looking back over the past year and saying, how effective was I? Maybe I should change my methods. Because I think that is what starts us back down that same path of, well, how can we do that better? What things can we package and repeat to accomplish that? And, systems don't love people. People love people. If I'm going to go and meet somebody, I don't refer to my handbook and say, how do I love this guy? I just love them. And then I don't try to, tick off accomplishments on my own life based on what's happening in his life, because that starts turning into control very quickly. I want to feel better about myself, so I want to somehow make more happen in this person's life. And you can't do that.
Right. Did you see I posted the other day, maybe a week ago, I don't know, about a facial recognition technology that
I did see something about that, yeah.
Different church. And one of the quotes, I kid you not, was, oh, well, we felt bad about people falling through the cracks, so we wanted a system in place where we could keep track of who's attending and things. And I thought, yeah, because nothing says, hey, I care about you, I missed you this week, more than an automated phone call from some system that noticed it hadn't tracked your face a few times in the last, however many weeks. And yeah. I remember, at the time of recording this, my dad doesn't have anything to do with the church or whatever. And up until about I don't know, I was in my early 20s, he had attended pretty faithfully, pretty regularly with my mom, our Plymouth Brethren church. And I remember it had been a few years since he did, a few years had gone by where he hadn't attended a single service. And there was I can't remember if it was the birthday party of someone or the anniversary or something like that. And it was held at, the basement of this church, the building anyway. When I say church, you know what I'm talking about. And, I remember my mom or my brother or someone telling me that someone came up to him and I forget what they said to him, but his response was, I haven't come in 3 years. You know what I mean? You just noticed now that I've not been around, you know? And when you have just a once a week thing, a number of weeks can go by and it doesn't mean if someone is all right or not, if you don't have interaction the rest of the week. You know what I mean? And then another friend of mine, the same church, he had been a part of it for 20 years and then started fellowshipping elsewhere. And I remember him telling me, Steve, I'd been a part of this church for 20 years and I don't know anybody and nobody knows me. And I don't, eat. I don't do things with other people during the week. And those kinds of things always sunk down in me, before I ever thought about how to do church and stuff like that. I don't want to be attending something and then I don't have anything to do with other believers the rest of my life, the rest of my week,
Right. Yeah, no. And, the place that I left, it's funny because there are some relationships that transcended that and then there are others. And I will say to that place's credit that historically, it has operated very much like a family, a relationship, or at least I thought so at the time. In hindsight, I think there are some things that I see I couldn't see at the time. But I was very close with a lot of people and getting together with them outside of Sunday. And it's funny how quickly that can change when you no longer have that thing in common. And I've very much enjoyed forming a different kind of relationship with friends who we've been getting together with every week, where we're just getting together for the sake of getting together. There's nothing more to it than that. And when we do so, it's usually for at least 6 hours, sometimes 9 hours at a time. And it's not a burden, it's good to be able to get together with people. So I don't know. Yeah, I think one of the things I started to see is how much there are things that pose as relationship, pose as community, when it's really not. It's something else. It's it's different.
Right. And so that's why some people can innocently quote Hebrews, about not forsaking the assembling of together, and they wholeheartedly believe a certain way of, looking at the back of somebody else's head and sitting in a pew and hearing a sermon and singing some word,
that's relationship.
They can believe that's what fellowship is, and don't forsake that.
Yeah, and if that's all you've ever known, then sure, I guess that's what you're going to stick to.
Right. So I have patience. I have understanding and grace for people who that's what they think when they're quoting that. And early of last year, I got to be on this radio show where they were doing a debate. Not a debate. It was about it's called Up for Debate, and they pit two different opposing views together. Yeah. And I got invited on to be more part of a panel rather than like a one side against the other with another guy who did house church, and then they got this other doctor guy on it and stuff. And I remember they had commercial breaks and they had different little segments they played. And I'm listening to where they take calls and stuff during the week and play the recordings. And there was things like, but Paul said not to forsake the assembling together. And, how do you serve if you're meeting in homes and stuff? And there'd be these questions where the beginning premise is clearly the only way you can meet is if it follows a certain pattern, a certain setup.
Yeah. You were talking about, talking to people that have these reactions and clearly, they're seeing things a certain way. It's like they're seeing things two-dimensionally, it's like they've never even heard of a third dimension. What are you they can't even conceptualize that. What is height? So yeah, the premise right from the very beginning when they're asking the questions is inherently faulty. They're trying to answer questions that don't need to be answered.
That nobody's asking.
That nobody's asking. Well, and I think potentially even more than that, one of the things I've come to see that there are certain problems and questions that only become problems because of the way that we're doing things. There's a lot of debate over, women being leaders in, authority positions in churches. And it's like, well, if you don't believe in authority positions over institutions of people, that is a non-problem. I mean, we're manufacturing a problem by arguing over who's in charge and who's in control. We're making it a power struggle. And that starts giving way to everybody's human nature, which wants the power and starts getting resentful when they don't have it and they can't have it because of, whatever classification you've put them in. But that's not the way it's supposed to be in the body of Christ, that we're all co-equal, one submitting to another, iron sharpening iron, each of us, filled with the Holy Spirit, having the minds of Christ. It's not, this person in greater measure and this person in lesser measure. Because of their gender, because of their whatever. I mean, we're all just co-equal dirtbags before God who have been saved by grace. Your dirt is dirtier than my dirt. It's ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, bro, I don't know how much time you got on your hands.
I still got some time.
Well, then, yeah. Let's keep going then. And I don't have any more specific questions I wrote down. But I'm enjoying this conversation.
Likewise.
Okay, so yeah, what else do you have on your mind? I wanted to ask you with regard to your fellowship and disciple making and stuff, and I think you answered that. Yeah, anything else you wanted to make sure to throw out there while you had an opportunity in a conversation like this?
I don't know how to really. I don't know even where to start, but I guess one of the things that God's been working on me a lot through all of this is a different understanding of the phrase our identity in Christ, who we are in Christ, abiding in Christ. These kinds of ideas permeate pages of the Bible, the New Testament. But honestly, it's not ever really clicked. It's never really made a lot of sense. One of the things that I had to start struggling with after I left is I started coming to the realization about how much of my identity was Daniel, the church guy. Daniel, the guy who, plays the music. He's the worship leader. He's the guy who preaches. He's the guy that whatever. But I was a doer. I did this and I did that. And there was a lot of, I could say pride that I took in that, and that's probably partly true. But more than that, identity. It was such a huge part of my life and who I was. And suddenly that wasn't there. And in my case, that's even heightened because I'm self-employed. I work from home. And so it used to be that the only two places that my life took place was at home and at church. That was it. And now one of those isn't there anymore. So I am home all the time, pretty much. And being self-employed, I don't even currently have employees under me, and doing most of my work for one client whom I don't speak with very often, honestly. So it's kind of there's room for contemplation there. Who am I? What am I? What am I about? What am I doing? And evaluating that, and evaluating what is our identity? Because naturally I start having these questions of, am I doing enough for God? And I think somebody who is involved in what we call ministry and everything like that, if you pose the question to them directly, nobody would say, oh yeah, I do for God to earn his favor. We never feel like that. And we say that, oh, that's a works mentality. God has grace on you. But, I said that. And when it's completely stripped away, when it's completely removed, and you find yourself clamoring with these questions of, what am I doing? What does God want me to do? Am I doing, you start realizing, where's that mentality coming from? Do I really feel that my identity in Christ is a child saved by grace, that he has really unidirectionally extended to me, not because of anything that I did reciprocating ever, past or present or future. And it's completely caused me to reevaluate the nature of that relationship in a way that would never have happened any other way. One of the themes that I see very common with I've connected with a lot of people online that are quote done with church. And one of the things that's very common is a season, at least initially, and for some it's shorter, for some it's much longer, of really kind of being isolated. And I've come to see that as actually a huge blessing in disguise. And when I talk with people who are going through that, I tell them to lean into it, soak it up. And I don't think that season is over. I mean, I enjoy having friends around me, but one of the things that I learned in that time when we left, there was a period where we were completely alone. I mentioned that I've got a lot of family extending in all directions, pastors, ministers, and whatnot. You can probably put the pieces together. What kinds of responses I've gotten from a lot of people in my family. So we were alone, not only from friends for a long time, but there was, and in some ways still is, relational problems there too. And there were days that my wife and I, there was one day in particular, I remember we're just sitting across the bed and we're staring off at the walls, both of us legitimately wondering, like, do we need psychiatric help? Like, really? Do we need to go? We were broken, and it was just, it was, it's not something I could describe. It's not something that could, I think, be understood unless you're in it. But in that time, you start looking for, something to hold on to. And in the absence of anything to hold on to, that's where I found my relationship with Christ in a completely different way. And I have that to look back on. And I appreciate being able to be around friends now, and regularly be talking with people about things and having that quote fellowship, Hebrews 10, 24, 25. But I'm not afraid of losing it either. There was something that it's a bittersweet looking back. There's something there that I don't have now, that I'd be okay with if it came back to that too. Because we always have to remember that Our relationship with Christ should not in any way whatsoever be dependent upon anything. It's not Jesus plus this or that. And that would include fellowship, and that would include leaders, and that would include institutions, and that would include doing things, even making disciples. That is not where we draw our worth from. He accepts us because he does. Who knows why? He has grace on us, but it's only that. And I think that there are aspects of my relationship with him that this whole process has brought me to that really could not have happened any other way at all.
Right.
So one of the things you've mentioned several times is this, false dichotomy between the two ways of doing things. And you're right. I am not against people who are doing things in an institutional way.
Right.
I am dubious of the effects that institutions have on a pure and simple faith. I think that there are things that creep in, mentalities that creep in, and they are unavoidable by doing things that way. We begin to wrap up our identities in different ways. We begin to form these chasms between those who are in charge and those who aren't. And you see it in little ways. The other day I'm driving around and I saw a billboard. It's saying, pray for your pastor. I don't know, was it a billboard? Or a billboard or something else. I heard on the radio, pray for your pastor today. And I'm just like, why him? I mean, I love him as much as I love anyone else, but why should we all gather together and pray for him?
Well, because he's extra special.
Because he's extra special, and he's got an extra burden to carry. But it's a burden that he's put on himself, and we all believe he should have because we believe that's the way it's supposed to be done. But it's another one of those problems we are actually manufacturing.
Right.
I heard or another little thing. I was listening to the radio one time, and this guy was talking. He was a pastor, and he'd gone to some other church in off hours, and he wanted to go check out their new stage setup. And so he goes in there and he's looking at it. Someone comes in and is like, "Hey, what are you doing up here?" And he explains that he's a pastor of another church, and they're like, "Oh, okay, cool. Well, here, let me show you around." Wait, what? Why? Why is it? That. So we don't see, when you're in a forest, you can't see the trees. You can't see the forest for the trees, rather. These are things little things that I couldn't have seen unless I had stepped away. And I think that's my concern. It's not against people and institutions, but I do have major concerns about institutions.
Or like the unintended consequences.
Exactly.
To use that phrase again.
Exactly. And it's unavoidable, really, in my opinion.
I've seen many people I've lived in 4 countries. I've lived in Europe as well as now here in South America, and in every situation I've had relationship to or connection to, I've seen people get steamrollered over by institution, if you want to call it that,
right?
Who it was where policies were more important than people. And right. then darn well a year or two later, the people who did the hurting could look back and admit, yeah, we should have handled that with more grace, and yeah, I regret how that, but I just look at it like, yeah, people fall off the bandwagon or in our context here, we've poured a lot of time and effort into some people who eventually just pack up and leave and feel like we weren't serving them good enough or whatever. And so I can appreciate if like a so-called pastor has like hundreds of people under him and people come and go. I can only imagine, how that can work and how that can look. But
it's impossible to have a relationship with hundreds of people.
Right.
There's no way that you can expect that guy to be gut-wrenchingly hurt,
right.
when that fails.
And when people listening to this, if they heard the last one I just did with Mark Burgess, and we were talking about how like your pastor can't disciple you.
No. For
all intents and purposes. But anyway, so I've seen people who, I don't want to use the phrase fell through the cracks, but even in our small setup, there's a guy who's just basically left his family and is in rank sin, and we're cleaning up the consequences of these decisions. But like, if you talk to him, he'll tell you like, we didn't do enough for him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff does happen where on the flip side, there are people who they leave fellowshipping together, whether that's institution or whether that's organic or however you whatever categories there are to phrase it in, where there are people who leave and they do have a heart problem, they do have issues, and that fuels their leaving. But that wasn't what I was going to get at when I said this. The policies that steamroller over people, I've seen where systems basically are more important than the people who make up those systems. And, there's even Mark Driscoll who's famous for having said something along the lines of like, oh, we're going to have a whole lot more people, thrown under this bus or however he worded it.
We're going to pilot bodies behind the bus. People wouldn't get it out of the way.
And, and so that's the kind of thing I do get concerned about and worried about it. But otherwise, I know plenty of people, just like you said, who are doing great jobs in a more of a institutional setup, and if they were to step down and leave, that those churches would not suffer and need to find a new pastor and all that kind of stuff, because they have a wealth of quality people in their midst that can take on the different burdens and stuff. And I know a pastor in particular who basically is like not even burdened. He describes it to me like he just kind of watches the show and sees what the people in his fellowship are doing and how they're growing. And he's the one that gives a sermon and stuff, but otherwise he could like leave for 6 months and the church wouldn't suffer. And so because so many people listening to this, probably aren't like into organic or done or these kind of things.
Sure.
I'm not saying that to cover my ground, but I think regular listeners know that I'm not that way. I'm not trashing one thing over the other. But I would say, I was very close with the pastor of the place that I just left, and I've known a lot of pastors, given my background, and they are genuinely some of the most fantastic people. Well intended. This is in no way. Again, I don't have issues with people. I think that there's a system that becomes larger than the sum of its parts. Right. It takes on a life of its own almost. It's bigger than the individuals that make it up. And I am in no way – like if my kids moved to this place, went to that place, if my kids when they got older even now sometimes they want to go to a youth group or something like that, they don't cease to be my kids. Right. And no more us with God. I mean, whether you are in a building, out of a building, in a system, out of a system, that has no bearing whatsoever on our relationship with Him. My concerns are more that the system creates blind spots, distortion fields that change the way that we view our relationship with Him. Right. And that's my bigger problem. It's not like, oh gosh, you're sinning and God doesn't love you anymore because you're a pastor. That's ridiculous. I mean, genuinely, people are doing everything that they know to do to serve God. But even that, I caught myself saying that this phrase, serving God. My parents, my grandparents, they used to, introduce their kids, their grandkids to people about how all their kids, how all their grandkids serve God, serve the Lord faithfully. Right.
And what I've come to realize is that what does that mean? What does that mean? It means that we were leaders and servants and title holders and whatnot in a church system. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that some of those family members would probably not introduce me in that way at all now. Right. Because I'm not serving God. And that is to kind of launch into maybe another thing, but one of the things I started to see is that we redefine a lot of things. We use a lot of phrases. We say, serving God. We say submitting to God. We say giving our money to God. We say evangelizing and bringing people to God. But what those things look like in practicality, when I evangelize, I'm bringing them to church. Mm-hmm. When I submit to church leadership, I'm submitting to God. When I give my money to the church, I'm giving money to God. When I serve in the church, I'm serving God. And what we don't realize is that in so many ways, church supplants God himself.
Right.
And oh man, that's dangerous. It's so dangerous. One of the things that came to my attention, my wife was reading something a while back, and it came to her attention, and she shared with me that in Exodus, when they built the golden calf, they called the word that they used for the golden calf was Elohim. And they didn't say they didn't turn away from God and serve another god, at least not in their minds. Because what they actually said was that this is the God who brought us up out of Egypt.
Right.
See, in their minds, they had played this bait and switch, this game, convincing themselves that they were going to merge and meld their ideas with serving God. And God wasn't going to go for that. I think that church, in so many ways, and I know this isn't a popular idea, but church in so many ways is a golden calf.
And I would venture to say so is ministry.
Yes. Or any doing that we do in place of a person whom we know and love. I mean, this is about a person, Jesus. This is not about a doing. The doing extends from the relationship. It's not the other way around.
Right.
And so,
well, do you know what's even more interesting to add? You know, this is in line with what you're saying. When I was thinking of mentioning this, and that you basically provided the perfect segue. Not only did they basically say, yeah, here are the gods that led you out of Egypt. Well, no, but anyway, when Moses was on the mountain the third time in Exodus 16 or whatever it was. And there's this whole other thing I want to do a podcast or a blog post about, where it says on the third occasion, it says that the Lord's goodness passed before Moses. And on that occasion, when he came down, that his face was shining. And they said, no, we got to cover that up and whatever. But anyway, when God wanted to have a relationship with Israel, and they basically said to Moses, no, you go. You hear him for us. You hear him for us. Yeah. You know, we're scared of him. There's nothing to be scared of, you know, like, and there's this thing where, the same thing later on, you got the book of Judges and then you get into Samuel. Israel wanted a king like the other nations when God wanted to be their king directly. And again, it's like, no. Let's form an institution. We don't want to do this relational stuff with him. Have somebody else kind of mediate between him and us. And in the case of Exodus, they're like, lest we die. You know, but you're not going to die. He wants to come be with you. And I think we keep kind of having ingredients of that in the way we go about things, you know?
Yeah, I think that this idea of setting up people over people is something that's inherent in our nature. I was watching a documentary recently. It was multi-part, and they were talking about, you know, their view on the history of man. And whatever you hold that to be, you could rewind, whether you think that we're coming from monkeys or coming from a garden. You can rewind to a time where there was no institutions among people at all. And if you're looking at it, you know, from the standpoint of Adam and Eve, it's family. There was no government. The first real institution that we see is the Tower of Babel. But what's interesting, and this relates to, you know, one of the questions I've asked a lot. What would God's form of government be? You know, is it democracy? Is it, you know, whatever? And, you know, a lot of Christians say, well, maybe it's a theocracy. And I would say not even that. When I look at the book of Judges, first of all, you look at Moses and Joshua, who were people, you know, called specifically of God, confirmed by miracles, set up by him. Nobody appointed them. Joshua appointed no successors in his place. They crossed over the Jordan into a land that God said they would live in buildings that they did not build and reap from vineyards and whatnot that they did not sow seed. And it was all just set up, and they walk in. And Joshua appoints no successor at all. And you go into this period of time of the Judges for several hundred years to, you know, maybe even 1,400 years, I've heard one guy say, but for some period of time. And there's a cycle very specific cycle that repeats itself over and over and over with every single judge. I forget how many there are, somewhere around 12, 13-ish, I think. But the cycle is exactly the same every single time. You start out where nobody's in charge. People begin to turn away from God. They begin to worship other gods, to the point even sometimes of sacrificing their own children to these other gods. Become reprobate in their rebellion against God. And every single time, God brings in nations surrounding them to captivate them, to in some way dominate them. And then they begin to say, oh, crap. And they turn to God and they say, what have we done? And call out to him. At that point, you have a judge raised up, not by people ever, never once appointed by people. God, from some obscure place, will raise up a person, and not for the purpose of being in charge over the people, but specifically for the purpose of dealing with the task at hand. This judge will free, with God's help, of course, the people from the captivity, from the oppression of the neighboring countries, and everyone rejoices. And for the duration of that judge's life, everything is good. The judge appoints no successor, again, dies, and the cycle repeats. People begin to turn away. And the last time we see that happen is with Samuel. Mm-hmm. Samuel is the first judge that actually tries to appoint successors, interestingly enough, appoints his sons, whom the people reject. And then their response is, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. Now, they have this long history to look back on and say, look, every time they have turned back to God, God has taken care of things. But they're not comfortable being reliant on a God that they cannot see, even with a flawless, spotless, miraculous track record. They want a man like themselves. Because ultimately what I think is in mankind's heart is they want to be in charge. So I want somebody who I believe best represents me and my motives, someone like me. So they want a king. They reject God. But in that time of the Judges, the very last verse in the book of Judges is saying explicitly that in that time, everyone did as they pleased because nobody was in charge.
Right.
Now, this is the promised land. This is the golden age of Israel before they're led out into captivity and ultimately scattered. That's the golden age. That was the pinnacle. That was what God brought them to. And they lost it and rejected it because they want, honestly, what we want. They want to have people in charge. They want to have systems that they can rely on for security. They want to abdicate their own direct relationship with God. They're like the people of Israel saying, Moses, you go up on our behalf. You talk to God. Because honestly, for a lot of us, I think it genuinely scares us to think that there is no mediator. There is nobody there to tell us what God has said so that we can have security in that. That was a long rant.
No, but that was good. I'm going to need to wind this up. I don't know if you got to get started in your day. But I really enjoyed this, and not only enjoyed it, but I would love to have you come on again and talk about who knows what. I enjoy this, pulling back and forth out of one another. Any final little kind of, thought, concluding remark or something like that you want to throw out there? How people can find your blog, anything you want to put out there?
I've said it all, I suppose.
Okay, so how do they find your blog?
Well, currently it's at dailey.wordpress.com, and that's Dailey, Dailey. I don't consider myself a blogger. I'm not very. I don't blog very often.
I'm so used to having authors or people on who. There's a book of theirs I read, or I'm letting them promote, or whatever the case may be, and I'm just so in the habit of like, okay, how can people follow? How can people get in contact with you again?
Yeah. Well, I throw some thoughts out there from time to time when it strikes me. So, but mostly I tend to try to have more of the one-on-one, like on Facebook and whatnot. And I've personally, and I don't fault anyone else for doing anything different, but I've really tried to just be like, there's so many times, Steve, where it's like, I'll have a conversation with somebody on Facebook. I'm like, man, that would make a great blog post. We're going to go, post that and, broadcast it to the world. And I think that I've become kind of, cautious of that.
That's fine.
Cautious of my motives. You know what I mean? Like, am I just trying to build a platform, or is that a nugget that, maybe God is doing something in a relationship there,
Right. Well, I can't fault you for motives like that. Okay. Well, I'm going to call it quits here. Thanks,
Sure.
Dan, for being on the podcast. And thank you to the rest of you for listening. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, or directly at fireonyourhead.com for more options. If you want to support Steve and Lily Bremner as missionaries in Peru, or find out more about what they do, be sure to head over to their blog at stevebremner.com, or check out Steve's Kindle books on Amazon and leave reviews of the ones you liked. See you next time.